Back in the late 90s, before all the gadgets, gizmos, and devices we have now, I was working up at a communications outpost in the Cascades. I absolutely loved it, but you really needed to be the type of person who didn't mind being alone. The place wasn't manned most of the year, but some of the dated analog equipment required regular maintenance during the storm season. They rotated guys through, 1 week on, 1 week off. You did your checks, your reports, and then the rest of the time you just sit, read, eat, stare out at the trees. You stayed at a tiny cabin with a diesel generator. No roads once the snow hit, just a snowmobile for emergencies. The nearest contact, to my knowledge, was about 12 miles away. I'd done 3 rotations before, and I knew the place pretty well. That's why the smoke caught my attention. I spotted it the second day of my shift, curling up from a ridge about a mile southeast. Too small to be a forest fire, but large enough that I took notice. The whole area is restricted land, so I radioed it in, but nobody acted like it was urgent. The assumption was it was probably some dumb hiker breaking the rules, so I let it slide. But it kept happening. Every afternoon for 3 days straight, I saw smoke rising up from the same spot, always in the afternoon, always gone by nightfall. By day 4, I decided to check it out for myself. Not protocol, I know, but the weather was calm and it was getting to the point where someone needed to intervene and let this person know that what they were doing wasn't safe. The area was patchy with snow, and even in the wintertime, dry wood can be extremely hazardous. If it was one single fire, one time, I get it, but doing this multiple days in a row was asking for trouble, and I wasn't about to let some idiot start a fire up there. I took the snowmobile down as far as I could and hiked the rest of the way in. When I reached the ridge, the smoke was already gone, just charred ground and a circle of stones where the fire had been. There were signs of a makeshift camp, tarp scraps, food wrappers, old clothes. Nothing was fresh, but the place didn't feel empty. There was this smell, not rot exactly, but metallic and sharp. The whole place felt off, like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I stomped out the coals and made sure the fire was completely dead, then took a stick and scratched into the soil around the fire pit a message: "No fires, dangerous." I hiked back to the snowmobile in silence. The whole way it felt like I was being watched. The rest of the afternoon was normal. I did some cleaning up around the cabin and some maintenance on the snowmobile before turning in for the evening. I don't know what time it was, but at some point in the middle of the night, something woke me up. A single knock on the door. At first, I couldn't be sure if I had dreamed it or not. I considered getting out of bed and checking outside just to be careful, but there was no further sound, so I convinced myself I was dreaming and rolled over to go back to bed. Then, another knock. I sat up and grabbed the emergency flashlight from the nightstand. I crept to the front window and peeked through the curtain. Nothing, just moonlight on the snow. Then, from behind the cabin, footsteps. I silently moved to the back window and looked out, but couldn't see anything. The footsteps continued to circle around, and then a crack, right against the back wall, like it had been hit with a tree branch or baseball bat or something. I immediately shouted that I was armed, which was met with total silence. Then came the tapping. It moved from the back wall to the side of the cabin and then around to the front, like someone was tracing the perimeter with a finger. And then the first window shattered. Glass sprayed across the floor. I dropped low with my back to a wall. Then another window shattered. Something hit the side of the cabin with a loud crash. I saw a rock bounce across the floor. A big rock. Then another. Whoever was out there was throwing them inside as hard as they could. And just like that, the chaos stopped. I stayed crouched behind the table for what felt like an hour. Finally, I heard crunching footsteps receding into the woods. I didn't sleep, just waited for sunrise. When I finally went outside, I found the front of the cabin peppered with rocks. All the windows were smashed in. No footprints except my own and one other set, large, heavy boots. They circled the cabin twice. And then I saw it. In front of the cabin, scratched into the dirt, it said, "Wrong. I am dangerous." I hiked out early, leaving my shift 2 days ahead of schedule, but I refused to stay out there any longer for that trip. Then I filed a report and made sure the company knew exactly what the situation was out there. They sent a ranger out with a couple guys to repair the windows. Evidently, they didn't see any indication of someone else being in the area. A month later, I heard from the guy who took over the rotation after the cabin had been repaired. He said he had seen smoke from a nearby ridge during his stay. And that was the last I heard about it. I do post-eviction cleanouts, private contractor. Usually it's just food rotting in a fridge, bags of trash, stuff left behind by people who couldn't or wouldn't move it all out. The only information I received about this gig was that it was a hoarder situation. 3rd floor unit, and the tenant had been evicted days earlier. The building manager said it had taken legal action to get the guy out of there, and he had to be forcibly removed. I was to just go in, clear it out, and get the keys back to him by the weekend. It's definitely not a job for the squeamish. I've seen some of the nastiest stuff in my life on these jobs. Each one feels like a crime scene, and you get a real window into the mind of the person who was living there in the days before they left, or in some cases, passed away. I headed over to the place directly from a job earlier that had taken me all day. My plan was to bang it out overnight and into the morning so I could take the weekend off. When I got there, the smell hit me before I even opened the door. Inside, it was wall-to-wall filth. Stacks of newspapers, junk mail, cracked Tupperware containers, some empty, some not-so-empty food cans, paper plates and plastic utensils piled all around, and then tons of old clothes. It was like someone had been living in a tank for years. But what stuck out to me off the rip was the theme. All the non-food clutter was child-related. Broken toys, faded baby blankets, old car seats and strollers, cribs with mold-stained mattresses, and children's clothes. It didn't look like a child had lived there. It looked like someone had been collecting things that a child would use. No photos on the fridge, no drawings on the walls, just a disturbing amount of kid stuff, like it was curated. I started clearing space in the deepest part of the apartment, furthest from the front door, with the intention of working my way backwards toward the entrance. In the back room, buried under some clothing and children's books, behind a medium-sized dresser full of random junk, I found a stack of cardboard shoeboxes duct taped shut. I can't really explain why, but something about the location of them, tucked behind this dresser and buried under a bunch of other stuff, felt like they had been deliberately placed there, like they were intended to be hidden. The dresser was extremely heavy, just packed with random crap. I tipped it over and pushed it out of the way. As I did, one of the legs caught the stack of shoeboxes, and the top box slipped off, falling onto the corner of the dresser. The lid popped off and the contents spilled out all over. Inside were photographs. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Most of them loose, some of them bundled with rubber bands. I pulled one out. It was a photo of a little boy, maybe 6 or 7, wearing a rainbow-colored jacket, walking into what looked like a schoolyard. The photo was taken from a distance with a zoom lens. Next photo, another boy. Different location, same style, far away, clearly candid, not posed. I kept flipping through them. All kids, all taken in public from behind or from across the street. None of them seemed to know they were being photographed. I had this terrible feeling about what I had found and didn't know how to process it. I wasn't sure what I should do next or if I should even continue cleaning, so I backed away and called my boss. I told him something wasn't right and that I needed him to come take a look. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. For about the next 10 minutes, I went through the rest of the room with a light touch, leaving the area around the photos undisturbed. It was the bedroom, and I was trying to shift the stained mattress off the box spring when I heard the front door open and then shut. I hadn't locked it behind me. I assumed it was my boss, and he had gotten there earlier than expected. I yelled out his name and that I was in the back bedroom. There was no response. I called out his name again, and still nothing. Then I heard someone moving through the river of junk in the hallway. Before I had a chance to leave the bedroom, a shadow spilled across the floor in front of the doorway, followed by a man who turned the corner and just stood there, blocking the exit. Mid-50s, unshaven, rail thin. The man said nothing. Then his eyes dropped to the floor, where the spilled box of photos sat. His face changed. I apologized and told him I was the cleanup crew and that I was just here to clear the place out. He didn't answer, he just stared down at the photos. Then he stepped inside and started trying to shut the bedroom door, closing us both in. It was this rush of movement, but he couldn't get the door to shut because it was blocked by so much crap on the ground. I backed away, telling him I could just go and come back later and that there was no problem. But he was raging, throwing his whole body weight into trying to close the door. He was just yanking on the door with all of his strength. I mean, like if somebody was fighting for their life level of intensity, over and over and over. The wood of the door wasn't breaking, but it was making this cracking sound and starting to bend on the top half where he was pulling on it. Behind me there were two small windows, one barred. Through the other, I could see the fire escape. I backed up to it, stumbling over junk, threw it open, and climbed out. The dude heard me doing this and started stumbling toward the window, slamming it shut behind me as I started down the ladder. Halfway down, something caught my leg, and I slipped and fell the last 6 feet, hitting the dumpster that was there and slicing open my arm. I scrambled out, bleeding, and ran to my van. I immediately called my boss again, who was like 5 minutes away at that point, told him to forget coming over and just to call the cops. I ended up going to the ER right away to get stitches. He texted me saying that the guy was gone when the police arrived. No sign of him, no shoeboxes, no photos. I have no idea what happened to that guy, if the cops found him or the photos, or if he just disappeared. I still think about the look on that guy's face though when he turned the corner, and all those kids. I know what I saw, and I know what that apartment really was. It wasn't a home, it was a collection. I had some trouble early on in my life, a difficult family situation, then later as a young adult caught a couple charges and ended up in a halfway house. Nothing major, but it was enough to make it difficult to find a job. I eventually found some work outside San Antonio as a cemetery groundskeeper. I've been here for almost 8 years now. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work and quiet, which is more than I can say for most jobs I've had. I mostly keep the lawn cut and do minor repairs, that sort of thing, but I have a story for you from early on in my time here. This was when I had just started working here. They'd been doing renovations and needed some extra hands. They were moving some of the older graves from the 1800s and early 1900s to a smaller plot across the property. I took it seriously. I had had other jobs at like liquor stores and bottle redemption centers, but this was my first kind of steady gig and I didn't want to lose it. It was pretty sensitive work. Some families still visited those graves, others hadn't been touched in decades. My job was mostly hauling crates and helping the guys from the city do the transfer. But after a couple weeks, something started bugging me. The crates got weirdly light. When I first started, I'd handled enough of them to know that something was off. It wasn't every single one, but certainly enough that it started to become noticeable. I had even helped with an exhumation there, and knew that unless it was a very rare situation that there should have been more in the containers. Maybe one that was too light you could kind of overlook, but not a bunch of them. So I started checking the containers. Not to get too graphic, but the remains weren't complete. Sometimes the skull would be gone. Other times it was the long bones, the femurs or arms, even the ribs. At first I thought maybe it was natural because I didn't know better. Things decay. Maybe we just didn't see everything. But after the third or fourth time I started keeping track. I made a list of the crate numbers and what was missing. Then came the one that did it. It was a child's grave. The headstone had worn down to almost nothing, but the date was still visible. The casket inside was small, and when we opened it, there was almost nothing left. A partial spine and one arm bone. That was it. Not even a skull. I brought it up to the guy who essentially ran the place, the guy who had hired me. He was quiet, probably 10 years older than me, and kept to himself. He just sort of shrugged it off like it wasn't that big a deal. He basically said that these remains were so old that it didn't really matter. Any relatives they had were all dead, and it's not like anybody would notice. I didn't push it, but I thought it was a weird response. Like, who treats human remains like that? If those were my relatives' bones and some had just randomly gone missing, I'd be pissed that this guy seemed to not give a shit. I'd at the very least want an explanation. I was new and didn't want to ruffle any feathers at that point in my life, so I just nodded along. But from then on, I started watching him closer. One night, I stayed late. I had some experience as a builder and planned to repair the little barn where we kept the yard equipment in. It had been damaged in a storm earlier in the week. The barn was near a far end of the plot, near a locked storage container that I had never been inside. None of the other guys I worked with had been inside it either. Nobody knew what was inside. Aside from retrieving the occasional piece of yard equipment, there was essentially no other reason to spend time over in that area. I parked around the back of the barn, got to work, and before I knew it, it got late. I was wrapping up and getting ready to split when that same guy I had spoken to about the remains showed up. I recognized his truck immediately. This is at like almost 9 at night at a cemetery. Literally no reason for him to be there. At first I thought he might be heading over to the little office area because he forgot something. But no, he drove almost directly toward me, stopping outside the storage container. He didn't see me, and I, for whatever reason, decided to not make myself known. I then watched him get out of his truck, walk over to the storage container, and unlock it. He then came back out with a cooler, which he loaded into his truck. Then he relocked the storage container, got in his truck, and drove out. I was perplexed and decided I would follow him. I kept my headlights off initially so he didn't see me pull out of the cemetery, and continued to follow him, not close enough to get spotted, but just enough to keep his taillights in view. He drove about 20 minutes out to a strip of additional storage units off a side road near the county line. I parked down the street and walked up on foot. I waited until he was inside the unit, then crept around the side. The door to the unit opened and closed vertically like a garage door, and he had left the bottom quarter of it open behind him. I bent down and looked under. The place was a workshop. He had a table set up with tools, brushes, bleach, gloves. Bones were laid out on towels. Some were labeled, some were wrapped in foam. There were plastic containers on the shelves labeled with dates. Some said adult, others said infant. One corner had cleaned skulls, posed like a fucking museum display. And worst of all, there was a clear tub in the corner. Inside were small, child-sized bones. I stood up and started backing away, trying not to make a sound, but at the same moment, he rolled the door up from the inside like he was going to go back and get something out of his truck. He just stood there, and so did I. He didn't look surprised to see me, and tried to break the awkward silence by telling me it wasn't what I thought it was, and that they were medical specimens that universities buy. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked out the way I had come in. He called out behind me, telling me not to be stupid, and that if I reported him, I'd be out of a job, and that he could easily get me in trouble with the police. I got back to my vehicle and left. Obviously, I called the cops immediately. I did not care if I was going to get fired for this. They showed up not long after and raided the unit. The story I heard was that when they arrived, he wasn't there, and neither were most of the remains. But then they went to the cemetery and found his truck there, and then found him trying to hide in the storage container with the other remains. I guess he thought if he moved them, he might be able to dodge the police before firing me and maybe buy himself a little time to cover his tracks. Guy was arrested. Turns out he'd been selling bones online to private collectors. Some of it went to black market dealers, some even went overseas. And yes, some were from children, from graves that hadn't been visited in decades. He kept records. They found notebooks, receipts, and emails. I still work at that cemetery, and I actually have his old job now. What pissed me off the most was wondering about all the families who assumed their loved ones were moved respectfully, buried with care. Meanwhile, some creep was pulling them apart like antiques. And the worst part is, he would have gotten away with it. No one noticed, except me.